You rejected me once, Your Majesty. Why should I believe you now? Claire Bennett's voice was quiet, but it was the only sound that mattered in the moonlit hall. Adrian Blackwood, the Alpha King, stood before her without his crown, without his royal guard, and for the first time in his life, without an answer. 6 months earlier, the entire kingdom had watched him reject his destined Omega before the moon altar. He had expected tears. He had expected pleading. He had expected Claire to ask him why. She had done none of those things. She had simply lowered her eyes, steadied her breathing, and said, "Then I have nothing left to ask of you." Now, standing outside her small home in Silver Hollow, Adrian finally understood what that silence had cost him. Rain whispered against the wooden porch. Claire remained in the doorway, wrapped in a simple gray sweater, her pale face calm beneath the soft porch light. She looked nothing like the frightened Omega he remembered from the ceremony. Back then, the grand hall had glittered with crystal chandeliers and silver banners, while hundreds of wolves watched their king make the decision that would change both their lives. The Moon Bond had chosen Claire. Everyone had known it. The moment the silver mark appeared on her wrist, the ancient hall had fallen silent. Adrian had looked at her, and for one heartbeat, his carefully guarded heart had betrayed him. He wanted her. Not because she was his destined Omega, but because something about her quiet strength made the endless weight of his crown feel lighter. Then he remembered the council. He remembered their warnings that an ordinary Omega could weaken the throne, divide the clans, and make the kingdom question his judgment. So he had chosen the crown over the woman standing before him. "I reject the bond," he had said. The words had traveled through the hall like winter air. Claire's fingers had tightened around the edge of her dress. For one fragile second, Adrian had waited for her to break. She did not. She looked directly at him and gave a small nod. "I understand." That was all. No accusation. No tears. No desperate request for another chance. She walked away beneath the watchful eyes of the kingdom, and Adrian told himself he had made the right choice. He told himself that a king could not afford to follow his heart. He told himself Claire would eventually return. She never did. Tonight, 6 months later, he had crossed nearly 200 miles to find her. He had left the palace without ceremony because he could no longer bear the silence that followed her absence. Claire studied him from the doorway. "Why are you here?" Adrian swallowed. The question was simple. His answer was not. "I came to ask you to come home." Her expression barely changed. "Home," she repeated softly. Adrian nodded. "The palace. The kingdom. Me." Claire looked at him for a long moment, and something in her eyes made the proudest Alpha King feel suddenly small. "You already made your choice, Adrian." The rain continued to fall. He had once believed silence meant weakness. Now, standing before the woman he had rejected, he finally understood. Her silence had been the strongest answer she could have given him. 6 months earlier, before the rain in the quiet house in Silver Hollow, Claire Bennett had stood beneath the silver light of the moon altar and watched the entire kingdom hold its breath. She had never dreamed of being chosen by an Alpha King. She had never wanted a crown, a palace, or a place among the powerful clans. Claire had grown up far from the capital, in a small mountain community where neighbors knew one another by name and every family helped when winter storms covered the roads. She had learned early that strength did not always announce itself. Sometimes it looked like getting up before sunrise. Sometimes it meant carrying groceries for an elderly neighbor or staying beside a frightened child until the fear passed. She had always believed that kindness was its own kind of courage. Then the Moon Bond chose her. When the silver mark appeared on her wrist during the ceremony, the ancient hall seemed to glow around her. Whispers traveled through the crowd. Some faces showed surprise. Others showed doubt. At the center of it all stood Adrian Blackwood, the youngest Alpha King in generations. He was respected across the kingdom for his discipline, his judgment, and his ability to carry responsibilities that would have crushed another man. Yet when his eyes met Claire's, something changed. For one brief moment, the king disappeared behind the title. Adrian saw only the woman standing before him, calm despite hundreds of watching eyes. He remembered meeting her weeks earlier near the palace gardens. She had not known who he was at first. She had simply spoken to him like an ordinary man, asking whether he was lost. He had smiled that day, something he rarely did. He had returned to the palace thinking about her voice. Now the council stood behind him, waiting. Their warnings echoed in his mind. The kingdom needed certainty. The clans needed a queen who understood royal traditions. Adrian looked at Claire again. She seemed nervous, but she did not look afraid. Somehow, that made his decision harder. "You do not have to accept me," she whispered before he could speak. Adrian's heart tightened. "I know. Then choose what you believe is right." Those words stayed with him. He told himself that she understood. He told himself that protecting the kingdom required sacrifice. He told himself that someday she would see why he had done it. But when he finally spoke, the words sounded colder than he intended. "I cannot accept this bond." Silence filled the hall. Claire looked down at the silver mark on her wrist. She took one slow breath. Then she raised her eyes toward him. "I understand." That was the moment Adrian made his greatest mistake. He had expected pain to bring her closer. Instead, her dignity created a distance he could not cross. Claire left the palace the next morning. She packed only what she could carry, returned to Silver Hollow, and refused every offer of sympathy. She did not speak badly about Adrian. She did not tell anyone that the rejection had hurt. She simply began again. Adrian remained in the capital, surrounded by advisors, ceremonies, and endless decisions. At first, he believed the ache in his chest would disappear with time. But days became weeks, and weeks became months. He would pass the gardens where Claire had once stood and remember the way she had looked at him without fear. He would hear someone laugh in the palace halls and wonder whether she was laughing somewhere far away. Most painful of all, there was no message waiting for him. No letter. No accusation. No request for another chance. Claire had given him exactly what he had asked for. Freedom. And slowly, Adrian began to realize that the freedom he had chosen felt nothing like victory. In Silver Hollow, Claire Bennet discovered that leaving the palace was easier than leaving behind the person she had been there. During her first week home, she woke before sunrise and followed the familiar mountain paths she had walked as a child. The air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of pine through the valley. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. She no longer had to wonder what the council thought of her. She no longer had to measure every word against the expectations of a royal court. Most importantly, she no longer had to wait for Adrian Blackwood to decide whether she was worthy of standing beside him. She had been rejected, and that truth hurt more than she allowed anyone to see. But Claire refused to let rejection become the definition of her life. She returned to the small community center near the edge of town and began helping wherever she was needed. She organized food deliveries for families during the colder weeks. She helped older residents with errands and spent afternoons teaching younger children to read. Little by little, people began coming to her with problems they did not know how to solve. Claire listened. She remembered names. She noticed who had stopped smiling and who had started pretending everything was fine. She never told them that she understood what it meant to hide pain behind a calm expression. She simply stayed. Within 3 months, the little building had become a place where people felt safe. Claire did not realize how much the town had begun to depend on her until one evening when Mrs. Harper, an elderly neighbor, placed a warm cup of tea beside her and said, "You know, you have a way of making people feel like they matter." Claire smiled faintly. Everyone should feel that way. Far away in the capital, Adrian was discovering the opposite. The palace was full of people, yet he had never felt more alone. His days were filled with meetings, ceremonies, and decisions about the kingdom. Advisors continued presenting him with potential matches, women from respected families who understood royal customs and carried impressive names. Adrian listened politely, but something inside him remained distant. None of them knew the man beneath the crown. None of them had ever asked whether he was tired before asking what he needed to decide. Claire had. He began remembering small moments he had once considered insignificant. The afternoon she had found him alone in the palace garden. The way she had laughed when she realized she had mistaken him for a royal guard. The way she had spoken honestly instead of carefully. Most of all, he remembered the moon ceremony and the quiet way she had accepted his decision. He had expected her to fight for him. She had respected his choice instead. That realization followed him everywhere. One evening, Adrian stood beside the palace window and looked toward the mountains beyond the city. His advisor entered with another list of names, but Adrian barely glanced at it. "No," he said. The advisor hesitated. "Your Majesty, you cannot continue refusing every proposal." Adrian turned toward the window again. "I know." What he did not say was that every refusal made him think of the woman who had never asked him to choose her. Meanwhile, Claire was learning to build a life that did not include him. She still thought about Adrian sometimes, especially when the nights were quiet. But she no longer imagined him coming back. She had stopped waiting for an apology. She had stopped wondering whether he regretted his decision. She had finally accepted something painful but freeing: a person could love someone deeply and still choose to walk away. And while Claire believed the story between them was over, Adrian was beginning to understand that his greatest mistake was not rejecting the bond. It was believing that Claire would always be there when he finally changed his mind. Adrian Blackwood had once believed that time would make his decision easier to live with. Instead, it had made the silence louder. By the 4th month after the moon ceremony, the Alpha King could no longer pretend that something inside him had not changed. Every morning, the palace moved according to the same precise rhythm. Bells marked the beginning of council meetings. Servants crossed the marble corridors with quiet steps. Advisors waited outside his study with reports about trade, border agreements, harvests, and the future of the kingdom. Adrian handled every responsibility exactly as he always had. He listened carefully. He made decisions without hesitation. He carried the crown as though it weighed nothing. Yet whenever the meetings ended and the palace became quiet, his thoughts returned to Silver Hollow. He began asking questions about the town without admitting why. How were the winter supplies? Had the mountain roads remained open? Were the families near the northern ridge receiving enough food? His advisors noticed. They also noticed that whenever Silver Hollow was mentioned, Adrian became unusually attentive. One afternoon, an official arrived with a report that changed something in him. The community center in Silver Hollow has expanded its assistance program, the official said. They are helping several families who were struggling through the winter. Adrian looked up from the papers before him. Who organized it? The official checked the report. Claire Bennett. Her name settled over the room. Adrian said nothing for several seconds. How many families? Nearly 40 at last count. The official continued speaking, but Adrian barely heard the rest. Claire was not waiting in Silver Hollow for the king who had rejected her. She was building something of her own. Something useful. Something real. That evening, Adrian walked alone through the palace gardens. Snow rested lightly on the stone paths, and the bare branches moved beneath the cold evening air. He remembered Claire standing in this same garden months earlier, holding a small basket of flowers she had gathered for the palace kitchen. She had smiled when she saw him. "You look tired," she had said. He had been surprised by the observation. No one spoke to him that way. Everyone usually asked what he needed. Claire had simply noticed him. Now he wondered how many moments like that he had failed to appreciate. The next morning, the council presented him with another proposal. A respected family had offered an alliance through marriage, and the council considered it an ideal solution. Adrian listened until the speaker finished. Then he quietly said, "No." The room became still. "Your Majesty, the kingdom needs stability. The kingdom has stability. The clans expect you to choose a queen." Adrian looked toward the tall windows. Beyond them, the mountains stood beneath a pale morning sky. Then the clans will have to wait. For the first time, he understood that his rejection of Claire had not made him stronger. It had only made him more aware of what he had lost. Meanwhile, Claire continued living quietly in Silver Hollow. She did not know about the council meetings. She did not know Adrian had rejected every proposal. She did not know that her name had begun appearing in palace reports. Her days were full enough without wondering about him. Yet one evening, while she was closing the community center, she found herself staring at the silver mark on her wrist. The moon bond had never completely disappeared. It had faded, but it remained. Claire gently covered it with her sleeve. She had accepted that some connections could remain without becoming a reason to return. What she did not know was that, hundreds of miles away, Adrian had finally stopped asking whether Claire would come back to him. He had begun asking a much harder question instead. If she ever saw him again, would she still recognize the man he had become? The truth reached Adrian through a report he had never expected to read. It was not a royal document. It was a simple account of what Claire Bennett had been doing in Silver Hollow since leaving the palace. 42 families had received food during the winter. 12 elderly residents had been helped with daily errands. Several young Omega children had found a safe place to study after school. Claire had organized everything without asking the palace for money, recognition, or permission. Adrian read the report. Twice. Then a third time. He had once called her too ordinary for the position beside a king. Yet the more he learned about her, the more foolish those words became. Claire had never needed a crown to lead people. She had never needed a title to earn their trust. She had simply shown up when people needed her. That afternoon, Adrian left the palace study and walked into the council chamber with the report in his hand. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. The advisors exchanged uncertain looks. "About what, Your Majesty?" Adrian placed the papers on the long table. "Claire." The room went quiet. One advisor cleared his throat. "We were aware that she had returned home. That was not my question." His voice remained calm, but every person at the table understood that the subject mattered. "We have received reports for several months," the advisor admitted. "Her community work has become well known in the Northern Territories." Adrian looked down at the pages. "And none of you thought I should know?" "Your Majesty, you made your decision regarding the bond." Adrian slowly lifted his eyes. "Yes. I did." The words sounded different now. They no longer felt like strength. They sounded like regret. That evening, he returned to his private study and found himself staring at an old map of the kingdom. Silver Hollow was marked near the northern mountains, almost 200 miles from the capital. He traced the route with one finger. He knew the distance could be covered in a few hours, but the distance between him and Claire felt much greater. He had no right to expect her forgiveness. He had no right to assume she would welcome him. Still, he needed to see her. Not as king. Not as the man who had rejected her. Just as Adrian. The next morning, he made a decision that surprised even his closest advisor. He would travel to Silver Hollow without a royal procession. No formal announcement. No council members. No crown. Only one trusted driver and a simple dark coat. Meanwhile, Claire was preparing the community center for another busy afternoon. She had no idea that Adrian was already on the road. She spent the morning sorting winter clothing, checking the pantry, and helping a young girl named Emily with a school assignment. When Emily finished reading the final sentence, Claire smiled. You did it. The girl smiled back. Because you helped me. Claire shook her head gently. You did the work. I only stayed beside you. Those words would have meant nothing to Adrian months earlier. Now they were exactly what he needed to understand. Claire never demanded credit. She never asked people to owe her anything. She simply gave what she could and kept moving forward. Near sunset, Claire stepped outside the community center and felt the cold mountain air settle around her. A dark car had stopped at the far end of the street. She noticed it, but thought nothing of it at first. Then the door opened. Adrian Blackwood stepped onto the quiet road. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Claire's heart recognized him before her mind could accept what her eyes were seeing. Adrian looked different without the crown. Less distant. More human. He walked toward her slowly, stopping several feet away. Claire, he said. She looked at him with the same calm expression that had haunted him for 6 months. What are you doing here? Adrian took a breath. For once, he had no prepared answer. I came because there is something I should have said a long time ago. Claire waited. And for the first time, the king understood that if he wanted another chance, he would have to earn the right to ask for one. I came because I owe you the truth. Adrian's words settled between them in the cold evening air. Claire Bennett did not move. The community center stood behind her, its windows glowing warmly against the blue-gray dusk, while a light snow began to gather along the wooden steps. She studied Adrian carefully. Without his crown, without the formal coat of the royal court, he looked less like the Alpha King and more like the man she had once met in the palace garden. Yet Claire knew better than to let appearances soften a decision she had spent 6 months making. The truth? She asked quietly. Adrian nodded. I was wrong. Claire's expression remained calm. About what? He looked down for a moment, as though the answer was heavier than he had expected. About you. About the bond. About what it meant to stand beside someone. Claire folded her hands in front of her. You made your decision. I did. And I accepted it. I know. The words came slowly. That is what I have been trying to understand. Claire said nothing. Adrian looked toward the community center, where the last few children were gathering their books before going home. I read the reports about what you have built here, he continued. I saw the families you helped. I heard about the people who come to you because they trust you. Claire gave a small smile. People do not need much. Sometimes they just need someone to listen. Adrian looked at her. That is exactly what I failed to understand. For the first time, Claire saw something unfamiliar in his expression. There was no command in his eyes. No expectation. Only regret. When the council warned me that choosing you could make the kingdom question my judgment, I believed them, he said. I thought being a king meant I had to choose what looked strongest from the outside. Claire lowered her eyes. And now? Now I know strength is not always what people see from a throne. The silence between them stretched. Claire could hear the soft scrape of snow against the porch railing. She had imagined this moment many times during the first weeks after leaving the palace. In those imagined conversations, she had asked him why. She had told him how deeply his rejection had hurt. She had demanded an explanation. But reality was different. The anger had faded long ago. What remained was a quiet understanding that she could not change what had happened. Why did you really come here? She asked. Adrian met her eyes. Because I wanted to see you without a crown between us. Claire's breath caught for the smallest moment. And what do you want from me? Adrian did not answer immediately. He could have asked her to return. He could have reminded her of the moon bond. He could have spoken as king and expected obedience. Instead, he simply said, nothing you are not willing to give. Claire looked at him for a long moment. That answer surprised her more than any grand apology could have. Adrian stepped back, giving her space. "I will not ask you to forgive me tonight," he said. "I only wanted you to know that I finally understand what I lost." Then he turned toward the waiting car. Claire watched him walk away. She had expected him to stay. She had expected another request, another promise, another attempt to persuade her. Instead, he was leaving without demanding anything. Her fingers brushed the sleeve covering the faint silver mark on her wrist. For 6 months, she had believed the bond was something she needed to forget. Now, for the first time, she wondered whether Adrian had finally learned the one thing she had always known. A bond could connect two people, but only choice could bring them together. For the first time in 6 months, Claire Bennett watched Adrian Blackwood walk away without trying to stop him. She remained beneath the porch light long after the car disappeared beyond the mountain road, listening to the quiet rhythm of falling snow. His visit had unsettled something she thought she had already put to rest. Not because he had asked her to return. He had not. Not because he had promised her a crown. He had offered nothing except the truth. And somehow, that was harder to dismiss. The next morning, Claire returned to her routine. She opened the community center before sunrise, prepared breakfast for the children, and sorted the supplies that had arrived from a nearby town. She tried to focus on the work in front of her, but Adrian's words kept returning. "I wanted to see you without a crown between us." She had spent months teaching herself not to wonder what he was thinking. Now she found herself wondering whether his visit had been a moment of regret or the beginning of something real. In the capital, Adrian returned to the palace alone. He did not tell the council everything that had happened. He simply entered the chamber and made an announcement that left everyone silent. "I will not accept another proposal." One advisor frowned. "Your Majesty, this cannot continue indefinitely." Adrian looked across the long table. "Then it is time we stop treating marriage as a political solution." The council members exchanged uncertain glances. "The kingdom expects a queen." Adrian remained calm. "The kingdom deserves a queen who chooses this life freely." The room became quiet. For months, Adrian had allowed others to define what strength should look like. Now he was beginning to define it for himself. Over the following weeks, changes appeared throughout the palace. Adrian requested that the council review the rules surrounding moon bonds and ensure that no Omega could be pressured into accepting a bond because of tradition or political expectation. He refused to name Claire in the discussions. He did not want his actions to become another form of pressure on her. He wanted the choice to remain hers. In Silver Hollow, Claire eventually heard about the changes. Mrs. Harper brought the news while they were organizing winter coats. "Your king is changing the rules," she said with a knowing smile. Claire looked up. "He is not my king." Mrs. Harper raised an eyebrow. "You know what I mean." Claire smiled despite herself. She read the announcement that evening. The words were formal, but the meaning was clear. Adrian was giving people the freedom he had once denied Claire without realizing it. She placed the paper beside her and looked through the window. The mountains were covered in fresh snow, and the moon shone above them. The silver mark on her wrist felt warmer than usual. She touched it gently. The bond was still there. But Claire no longer feared it. She had learned that she could live without Adrian. That knowledge had changed everything. Several days later, another message arrived from the capital. Adrian would be visiting the Northern Territories to review community programs. Silver Hollow was included on the schedule. Claire stared at the letter for several seconds. This time, Adrian would not be arriving secretly. He would come as king. And she would have to decide whether she wanted to see him again. When Adrian arrived in Silver Hollow 2 weeks later, the town gathered near the community center. Claire stood among them, calm and composed. Adrian stepped from the carriage and saw her immediately. Their eyes met across the snowy street. Neither smiled. Neither looked away. Then Adrian walked toward her, stopping several feet away. "Claire." She nodded. "Your Majesty." His expression softened. "I was hoping you would call me Adrian." Claire held his gaze. "I was hoping you would give me a reason to." For the first time, Adrian smiled. Not with confidence. Not with pride. With humility. "Then I will spend as long as it takes." 2 weeks later, the first winter sun rose over Silver Hollow as Adrian Blackwood returned to the community center, but this time he did not arrive as a king expecting attention. He arrived early, carrying boxes of supplies himself. Claire Bennett watched from the doorway as he set the first box on a wooden table. "You are doing that yourself?" she asked. Adrian looked up. "I was told these boxes needed to be moved." Claire glanced toward the 3 waiting staff members. "You have people for that." He gave a small smile. "I know." She studied him, trying to decide whether this was another performance for her benefit. But there were no royal banners outside. No council members followed him. He had simply come to help. Over the next several days, Adrian kept his distance. He attended meetings with local families, listened to concerns about heating costs, and asked questions without assuming he already knew the answers. Claire noticed something else, too. He listened to her. Not as an alpha king listening to an omega. Not as a man trying to reclaim what he had rejected. He listened as Adrian listened to Claire. That difference slowly became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, they walked along the snowy path behind the community center. The mountains stretched beyond them beneath a pale blue sky. "Why did you change the bond laws?" Claire finally asked. Adrian was quiet for a moment. "Because I realized nobody should lose their freedom because someone else is afraid of what they might choose." Claire looked toward him. "Was that about me?" "It started with you," he admitted. "But it became bigger than us." She nodded slowly. "That matters." Adrian stopped walking. "Claire, I need you to know something. I did not come here to convince you that we belong together." She looked at him. "Then why are you here?" He met her eyes. "Because I want to become someone you could choose without feeling obligated." Her expression softened, but she did not answer. Adrian understood. This was not the moment for a promise. It was a moment for patience. So he gave her exactly that. He returned to the capital several days later, leaving Claire with no request and no expectation. Yet something had changed. Their conversations had become easier. Claire found herself smiling when Adrian entered the room. Adrian found himself looking forward to the smallest moments, like hearing her laugh with the children or watching her carefully organize supplies. Neither of them spoke about the bond. Neither tried to force the future. Then, one evening, a letter arrived at the palace from Silver Hollow. Adrian opened it expecting a report about the community center. Instead, he found a short handwritten note from Claire. "Thank you for listening." 4 words. Adrian read them several times. He placed the letter carefully inside his desk, beside nothing else. In Silver Hollow, Claire sat by her window and looked at the faint silver mark on her wrist. She no longer saw it as a chain to a decision someone else had made. It was simply a reminder that some connections could survive distance, silence, and even regret. But if she ever chose Adrian again, it would not be because the moon bond had chosen for her. It would be because the man standing before her had finally learned how to let her choose. And somewhere in the capital, Adrian understood the same truth. He had once believed that being chosen by fate gave him the right to decide her future. Now he knew better. If Claire ever came back, it would not be because she belonged beside the throne. It would be because she wanted to stand beside him. The spring thaw arrived quietly in Silver Hollow, turning the snow along the mountain roads into clear streams that shimmered beneath the morning light. By then, Adrian Blackwood had stopped counting the weeks since he first returned to Claire. He no longer measured his progress by whether she smiled at him or whether she spoke his name. He had learned something harder than patience. He had learned to let her decide. What came next? Claire noticed the change. She noticed it when Adrian visited the community center without announcing his arrival. She noticed it when he listened to local families instead of speaking for them. She noticed it most when he disagreed with someone and still took the time to hear them out. The man who had once believed leadership meant making the difficult choice for everyone was slowly becoming a man who understood that trust could not be commanded. One evening, Adrian stood outside the community center beneath a sky filled with fading gold. Claire approached him holding a small envelope. "This came for you," she said. Adrian accepted it and looked at her curiously. "What is it?" "Open it." Inside was a formal invitation to the Moon Festival in the capital. Claire had been invited as a representative of Silver Hollow because of the community work she had done throughout the winter. Adrian read the invitation, then looked at her. "Are you going?" Claire took a slow breath. "I think I am." His expression changed, but he did not ask her to sit beside him at the ceremony. He did not assume anything. He simply said, "I am glad." The journey to the capital took several hours. When Claire finally entered the palace, she felt the old memories return. The marble floors. The tall windows. The silver banners. The same hall where Adrian had once rejected the bond. But this time, she did not enter as an uncertain Omega waiting for a king to decide her future. She entered as herself. Adrian saw her from across the hall. For a moment, the room seemed to disappear. He walked toward her slowly, stopping several feet away. "Claire." She smiled. "Adrian." His eyes softened at the sound of his name. He had waited months to hear it again. Yet he did not reach for her hand. He waited. Claire looked around the hall, then back at him. "You changed a lot." Adrian smiled quietly. "You gave me a reason to." She shook her head. "No. You chose to change." He nodded. "You are right." The Moon Festival began beneath a silver moon, and the ancient bond mark on Claire's wrist began to glow softly. A murmur moved through the hall. The council watched. The kingdom watched. But Adrian did not look at the mark. He looked only at Claire. "I will not ask the bond to decide for us," he said. "I will not ask the council. I will not ask the kingdom. I am asking you." Claire's eyes filled with quiet emotion. "And what are you asking?" Adrian took a breath. The Alpha King who had once spoken with absolute certainty now stood before her with nothing but honesty. "I am asking whether you would choose me." Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped closer. She placed her hand in his, not because fate demanded it, not because the kingdom expected it, and not because she had forgotten what happened 6 months earlier. She did it because she had seen the man he had become. Adrian closed his fingers gently around hers. The hall fell completely silent. Claire looked up at him. "Then this time, Adrian, I choose you." The silver light around them grew brighter, but the moment belonged to neither crown nor bond. It belonged to two people who had finally learned that love was not about being chosen by destiny. It was about choosing each other freely. And that night, beneath the same moon that had once separated them, a king finally understood what Claire had known all along: the person you love is never something you own. They are someone you are grateful to be chosen by.